Welcome, Psych 9A, PSB 11A faithful. Here we all are, Thursday, 8 in the morning. It's very good to see you. The light is visible at the end of the tunnel at this point. In 1.5 weeks, this course will be complete. We will have taken our final exam, and probably in 2 weeks' time, well, you'll have your grades returned, and hopefully you'll be happily enjoying the beginning of your spring break. At the end of today's lecture, we'll be 90% of the way through the course. That's really very good. We're making great progress. Now let's see. We are finishing up material in Chapter 5. If I speak at my normal pace, there's some chance that class will end a little bit early today, which isn't all bad. If I draw things out, it'll probably be about the same speed. Tuesday, the same duration as usual. Tuesday, we'll start in on Chapter 6. So I think there's no question in my mind that what you've got to do this weekend, if you haven't already, is read Chapter 6, because we will be going over Chapter 6 on Tuesday and part of Thursday next week. Also on Thursday next week, we will review for the final in the sense of figuring out how many questions of each variety we're going to have, what a possible bonus essay question might be. Going to remind you about all the pictures that you might need to label, stuff like that. So do show up 1 week from today. In the latter part of that lecture, we'll certainly go over the final exam, how to prepare for it. So in the meantime, I thought I'd just complete Chapter 5. Let's start up. While we're finishing Chapter 5 here, and we're going to talk about what are known as perceptual constancies. And the idea here is something that we talked about early on after the midterm, which is the difference between the proximal stimulus that we receive, the information that we receive at our senses, and the distal stimulus, or the distal objects that we would actually like to learn about. So, for instance, we do not sense anything in the real world in any direct fashion. Instead, we, receive light photons. These arrive at our retinas and get absorbed. Or we receive sound pressure waves, and we end up hearing somebody talk. Or we receive signals from Pacinian corpuscles and infer that our skin has been touched, something along those lines. So we receive proximal stimulation. Nevertheless, we do a really nice job of reconstructing a sort of a world, a perceptual world that is inhabited by objects and people and things. And how do we get from the proximal stimulus to the real world? Well, perceptual constancies are an important part of this, and there are several constancies we're going to consider. I'm going to talk first about size constancy, and size constancy illustrates pretty well the sort of problem that is solved by the visual system, determining an object's true size when provided solely visual information. And the important thing to realize is when we're trying to infer an object's true size from visual information, we can do that provided two pieces of information. And those two pieces of information are the retinal image size of the object that we're looking at and, the distance. So, for example, I can figure out the exact three-dimensional length of my thumb, whatever that is, 1.5 inches, 2 inches, provided that I know exactly what size of a picture it makes on my retina and the distance from my eyeball out to that thumb. With those two pieces of information, I effectively get two sides of a triangle that I can then sort of use to infer, what that third thing is by similar triangles, the actual size of the thumb in the real world. Now, retinal image size, as you know, is something that grows as an object comes closer and it gets smaller as the object moves away. So people in the front of the classroom for me give large retinal image sizes. People in the back of the classroom, well, tiny pictures on my retina are the result. So retinal image size varies fairly directly with distance. If we actually know what that distance is, we can figure out the true size. Helmholtz said, aha, what we do to figure out an object's true size and represent it in our perceptual reconstruction of the world, Helmholtz said that what we do is make an unconscious inference. And what we do is use the retinal image size, which is given to us through the visual stimulation, together with an estimate of the distance to the object, and those two things together will tell us what the object's true size is. Now there's two important things here. One, the retinal image size, known information, and the estimated distance, which is something we're estimating, those two numbers will tell us how big the object is. Second, we use those two pieces of information in what he called an unconscious way. And this is not, Freudian or the collective unconscious or anything like that. It's simply more an automatic process carried out by our brains that we're not normally aware of. Okay? So our consciousness extends towards a lot of brain functions. We can think, we can pay attention to specific things out there in the world, but believe me, there's a lot going on in our brain that we are not directly aware of. And what Helmholtz said, aha, here's yet another thing that happens automatically that we're not directly aware of, and that is to infer an object's true three-dimensional size. How do we do that? Well, we take the retinal image size, we have an estimate of the distance, those two things together help us figure out what the object's true size is. We do this unconsciously. So for example, I know that everybody in this room is approximately of adult human size, and even though those people way in the back give me tiny retinal images, I don't say these are miniature people. No, I know that they are, just average-sized people. I do this automatically. It's something I do without needing to be conscious of it. And that's what unconscious means in this particular case. We take the retinal image size, estimate of the distance, and we infer what the true size is in an automatic way of which we're not conscious. So we're doing that again in this picture. There are a number of cues to depth in this particular picture, and I can see a couple in particular. It looks as though we have parallel lines in the three-dimensional world that are converging towards a point, a vanishing point in the distance about right here for this picture on the left. So all of these lines along the floor, they're all sort of converging to a point here, and that's the vanishing point. What do we know about the vanishing point when it comes to perspective? We know that the vanishing point is really, really far away. In fact, it's at an infinite distance from the viewer. So things that are closer to this point right up here that I'm indicating with the laser light effectively are at a greater distance. Things that are far away from the vanishing point, say objects in the foreground of the picture at the bottom, well, they are closer. So there's, nice depth cues going on in this picture, and they help us interpret what's going on with these black silhouettes. So this looks like some fellow who is relatively close to us, somebody at a medium distance, somebody at a far distance, and what can we say about the sizes of the retinal images presented by those three figures? Well, the retinal image of the one in the front is larger than the retinal image of the one in the back. This is a bigger picture, this is a smaller picture. What would happen if we were to take this same retinal image and place it at the medium and far distances? Well, we would have what we see on the right, some sort of anomaly in which we have a person who is growing as we move farther away from the viewer. So we are really taking distance into account when we infer 3D size. It really makes a difference whether the person is up here in the front close to us at a medium inferred distance, or at a far inferred distance. And you can see the difference that makes simply by using the same size of retinal image. And we have this giant silhouette in the back in that case. So, two variables, retinal image size and estimates of distance. Now let's continue with size constancy. This is a well-known illusion called the Ponzo illusion. How many people have seen the Ponzo illusion? Good. It's a common one if you go to a visual illusion website or what have you. And the idea here is that we have our two slanted lines on either side, and then we have these two horizontal lines in the middle, one above and one below. And most people agree that the two horizontal lines do not appear to be of the same length. Most people would say one of those horizontal lines is longer than the other. And most people would say it is, which one appears longer? The one above. Most people say it's the above line that appears longer, and you have to wonder why that is the case. Well, does this little diagram remind you of anything? I know what it reminds me of. It reminds me of railroad tracks. So here are the tracks going off into the distance. This is close to us in the foreground. These are the tracks going off into the distance, so this is far away, relatively speaking. And then we've got railroad ties. So this is a horizontal piece of wood here. This is a horizontal piece of wood here. Those are the ties between the two tracks. That's what it reminds me of. If you don't like ties, this could be a road, and these could be the curbs on either side of the road, and we're still going to get the same interpretation of this picture in terms of depth. And what the interpretation is that towards the bottom we're talking about things that lie closer to us, the viewer. At the top we have things that are farther away from us. So what this means, for one, is that our minds try to construct 3D interpretations of what they see. That's a very important principle. And in this particular case, we're getting tracks that are receding in the distance as we move up the picture. And that information is not actually present in this picture. This is a flat, two-dimensional diagram with 4 line segments. So any distance that you might see here, or any interpretation in terms of railroad tracks or roads or what have you, it's all up here. And it is the brain working overtime to interpret things as being part of the normal 3-dimensional world. And in this case, we have the impression that things here are closer, things above are farther away. Now, what does that mean for the perceived lengths of the horizontal bars? Well, it means exactly what we perceive. These two line segments, above and below, are of identical physical length. So they're of the exact same length. And what can we then say about their retinal image sizes? The size of the picture that those two horizontal bars make? Well, it's the same size. It's the same length of line on our retina caused by those identical length horizontal lines. But when we try to infer 3D size, there are two variables. Not only do we need to worry about the retinal image size, which is identical, we also have to worry about estimated distances. And our estimate of this distance is, well, this one's relatively close to us, and above, though, this one's relatively far away from us. And so what does that mean about the perceived size? Well, this one will be smaller because it lies closer to us. This one will be larger. It will be longer because it lies farther away from us. Does that make sense? To get this length of line for something that's far away, well, it must be pretty big. It must be a long line, and it ends up looking longer, even though it's of physically the same length as the one below. So that's the Ponzo illusion. And it's a consequence of the fact that we estimate this line segment is lying closer, and this line segment above is lying farther away. Here is something similar. This is a Miller-Lyer illusion. And it's an illusion because these vertical line segments here at the left and here at the right, the vertical line segments are of identical length. Now, if you look at that, one of those vertical line segments looks longer. How many people think the one on the left looks longer? How many people think the one on the right looks longer? Yeah, most people would say yes. The one on the right looks longer. We have to ask ourselves why it looks longer, because in fact they are of the same length. And the principle, again, is that the visual system works over time to try to reconstruct a three-dimensional world in which depth plays a role. So even though these are flat pictures, the brain will try to interpret these stimuli in terms of three-dimensional things. And in fact, the stimulus suggests corners of a room seen from the outside or from the inside. So let's say we have a room here, and we would get these corners, and you can see that the little vertices at the bottom and the top sort of go like this. They try to enclose our vertical line segment. Let's go back one. You can see it resembles the one on the left. Now, if we're inside the room and looking at a corner, then the vertex here, formed by those edges with the floor and the ceiling, well, now it's facing the other way, and that resembles what we had, whoops, on the right. So the idea then is when we see something like this stimulus, we see this as an edge that is close to us with walls on the left and the right that are receding into the distance. And that's what we have here. On the right, we see this edge as something that's farther away from us with walls on the left and right that are coming towards us, that are enveloping us, as in this picture here. So what that means in particular is that this edge is closer to us on the left. That edge is closer to, farther away from us. And what that means is that we're going to have a perceptual illusion. These two vertical lines are of identical length. This one is perceived as closer, so it must be actually smaller in the real world. This one is perceived as farther away, and well, that means it must be larger in the physical world. And so we end up with that illusion. And here we go again, the Miller-Lyer illusion. And now we see pretty clearly, yes, these two dark line segments, which are of identical length, appear to have very different perceived lengths. And this one again is perceived as longer on the right, and the one on the left is shorter. Why is that? Well, because this edge is perceived as lying closer to us here on the left. The one on the right is perceived as lying farther away. And so we judge true length based on those distance estimates. So, size constancy, yet another example. How many people have noticed that the moon, when it's against the horizon, can look really large sometimes, but when it's up in the sky, typically it looks like its usual sort of small self. People have noticed this. Good. Now, the moon, the actual moon, is not changing size. In fact, if you measure the retinal image size of the moon, it doesn't really matter whether you're seeing it on the horizon or whether you're seeing it above. The retinal image size of the moon is not changing. So why does it appear to be big when it's against the horizon and small when it's up in the sky? Well, you probably are getting the principle by now that if something is perceived to lie very far away, then for a given retinal image size, it'll appear larger. If something appears to lie closer to us, then for a retinal image size, it's going to be a little bit smaller. Just like those illusions we were just talking about. And what people have figured out is that when we look along the ground to see the moon just above the horizon, there are many, many, many depth cues telling us that the moon is far away. For instance, we might see distant trees or distant mountains or low-lying clouds. We're going to get all these cues saying, wow, that moon is really, really, really far away. When we look straight up in the sky, Are there any trees or mountains or anything telling us that the moon is far away? No, I'm afraid there aren't. There might be some clouds, but that's it. Depth cues for the moon directly above us are weak. So we don't perceive it as lying as far away as we do when the moon is on the horizon, when there are plenty of depth cues saying it's far away. So the result is that, in a sense, we perceive the distance of the moon as far away on the horizon, but relatively closer when it's directly above us. So even though the moon's true distance is better approximated by this circular path, that's not the way we perceive it. It's more like this. It appears to lie closer when it's directly above us, and as a result, the moon is perceived as large against the horizon and small directly above. So that is a size constancy illusion. We're trying to perceive the true 3D size of an object. Two pieces of information are there: the estimate of distance, which can be imperfect, and the retinal image size. And this can lead to illusions. Now, there are other constancies. Certainly, it would be nice to perceive an object to have a shape that does not change if it is an object with a constant shape. So here's a little book, The Science of Reincarnation. What is this doing here? Anyway, here's a little book on the science of reincarnation. And, you know, I can hold it this way or that way, or I can tilt it this way. And you'll see it's basically a little book with more or less the same shape. The shape does not depend on how I hold it. And that's the basic idea. You really don't want the shape to change a lot as you change your viewpoint. So if we have a square piece of cardboard and we're holding it in front here, then we'll say, okay, I see a square piece of cardboard. If we now tilt that square piece of cardboard back a little bit, hopefully we will still see a square piece of cardboard, and in fact we do. In fact, we can put that square piece of cardboard on a table in front of us and it will still look like a square. Now, it turns out that the image that is presented to us on the retina does change as we move our square piece of cardboard from the upright position to the flat position. And if you think about it, it looks more like a trapezoid, the image it is made on our retina as it gets flattened. Now, do we end up seeing our square piece of cardboard as a thing that changes its shape from a square to a trapezoid as we go like this? No, we don't. Our square piece of cardboard looks like a square piece of cardboard. That's the way it looks. So that is shape constancy. And this is something that is going on all the time. We're taking into account our viewpoint and the sort of attitude of an object in the real world to reconstruct its three-dimensional shape, which is something that really should not depend on whether it's upright or lying down. So, determine an object's true shape. Now, shape constancy, again, is taking into account depth information and orientation information. And there's some of these things present in this particular illusion, which is known as a tabletop illusion. So here we have a table, and there's its table top. There's another table over here, and that's its top. And if you had to say which of these tables was longer, which would you say? The one on the left? I think most people would. Most people would say the table on the left here is longer and narrower. They'd say it's longer and narrower than the one on the right. This one is shorter and wider. Now, it turns out that this shape here is identical to that shape there. And if this is a good illusion, that should be hard to believe. Can people believe that those two tabletops can be cut out and placed exactly on top of one another? Well, it's true. In fact, if you were to take some scissors and cut out this tabletop here, you could place it exactly on top of that tabletop. So from the two-dimensional flat point of view, the tabletops are identical. But the visual system is not reconstructing two-dimensional worlds. It's constructing three-dimensional representations. And in that case, well, these two tables are very different. This is close, that's far. This is obviously going to be a longer table. This one's going to be wider, and they have different shapes. That's the way we perceive it, and that's a consequence of the fact that we are reconstructing three-dimensional tables, not flat pieces of paper that we can cut out and paste on top of one another. So we have an animated version, and let me see if I can get this to work for you. And you'll notice that I'm not using that computer I have been using. Once I discovered that its operating system was no good, I said, well, maybe what we should do is use this computer. So I'm praying that this will work. Matchbox's illusion. There we go. So this is actually showing that we have two matchboxes, and the top of the matchbox is now the tabletop. And I hope you'll agree that the matchbox on the left appears longer than this one on the right. Do people agree? Okay. So if you can cut out the top of that matchbox and place it perfectly on top of the one on the right, then we can prove to ourselves that yes, there is an illusion here, and yes, there is an illusion. The matchbox on the left looks longer than the one on the right. Nevertheless, when it comes to their two-dimensional shapes, they're identical. And that means to us that our perception is really based on estimates of three-dimensional size and shape, not two-dimensional. So that's sort of a nice illusion. Matchbox illusion. We'll put you away and go right back. So does this make sense to people? We're reconstructing a three-dimensional world, and this can lead to some illusions. Okay, another constancy. We are trying to reconstruct a three-dimensional world, and we're also trying to reconstruct surface properties as well as the properties of lights shining on surfaces. And what lightness constancy refers to is our ability to determine how well a surface reflects light. And the idea is that if I am wearing a white t-shirt in a dark room, well, we'll see it as a white t-shirt, but the actual amount of light reaching the eye will be pretty small. If I now step out on a sunny day outdoors wearing my white t-shirt, the amount of light reaching the eye will be 1,000 times greater than what it used to be. But we'll still see it as a white t-shirt. So there's some sense in which we're perceiving this shirt as being white over a 1,000-fold change in the amount of light that it's giving to our retinas. And the fact that we perceive it having the same lightness, namely being a white t-shirt, well, that's lightness constancy. This would also be true for a black t-shirt. A black t-shirt has less propensity to reflect light. If we have a very dark black t-shirt, it might reflect only 8% of the light that strikes it. Only 8% might be reflected back. A white t-shirt, on the other hand, might be reflecting 40% of the light back. So the thing is that we will perceive a black t-shirt as black in a poorly lit room or on a very, very sunny day outdoors, where the amount of light reaching us from the black t-shirt will be many, many times what it is in the dark room. So in some sense, we are abstracting away in our perceptual representation the surface's ability to reflect light, irregardless of whether we're shining a dim light on it, like in this classroom, or whether we're outdoors on a very sunny day, shining much more light on it. So that's known as lightness constancy. And what we're determining is a surface's propensity to reflect light. So the basic fact is that the intensity L of the light reaching the eye is a product of two things: the intensity of the light shining on it, which is I, and the ability of the surface to reflect light, which is the surface reflectance R. So the light that comes to the eye is the product of the intensity of the illumination and the reflectance. And it turns out that the visual system is very good at taking this product, the light reaching the eye, and splitting it into how much light is shining on the object, and how good is the object at reflecting light. So this sort of illustrates what the visual system does. If this is a shaded image, and we can see here that there are 4 blocks, then what the system is able to do is to decompose this pattern of shading into effectively a description of how well the surfaces reflect light, and that's shown down at the bottom left, and a description of how much light is shining on each surface, and that's shown down here on the bottom right. And the important thing for lightness constancy is when we see this picture, we say, yeah, there's 2 medium gray blocks, and then there's 2 darker gray blocks. And so what the visual system is doing is it's effectively using some sort of reflectance image to come to that judgment, and that's shown down here on the bottom left. As far as the propensity of surfaces to reflect light goes, this is what we've got. 2 medium grays and 2 dark grays. We're able to discount variation in the light shining on these surfaces. When it comes to lightness constancy, you get all sorts of fun illusions, and I just want to share some of these with you. There's a fellow at MIT who's very well known for the study of these illusions. His name is Ted Adelson, and if you go to his webpage and find his gallery, I think you'll find a lot of interesting lightness and other illusions. So, this illusion is White's illusion. And you have to ask yourself, well, that doesn't look like an illusion to me. Well, let me tell you that the gray in these 3 bars on the left is physically identical to the gray in these 3 bars on the right. So all the gray sections in that picture are identical. Most people would say, though, that, the 3 grays on the left appear lighter than the 3 grays on the right. Do people agree with that? Yeah, so what the visual system is doing when it figures out how to perceive this gray, it actually ends up comparing this gray on the left to the black on either side. So it looks as though it's part of this black bar, so this gray ends up getting compared to black, and as a result of contrast, ends up looking brighter. Simultaneous contrast. What about these gray areas on the right? Well, they are perceived as being parts of the brighter white bars. And so the gray ends up getting compared to white, and as a result of simultaneous contrast, looks darker. Darker, 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 lighter, lighter, lighter. We end up having White's illusion. So it's a form of simultaneous contrast. That's how most people interpret this. Now, there are some corrugations, and I'll let you look at these. They depend a lot on our perception of illumination and perception of orientation of a surface. And let's see. Here's a good one. So this square, indicated by the arrow above in C, and that square, indicated by the arrow below in C, are of identical gray value. Speaking physically, but I think most people would say that this gray appears to be a darker gray above. This one below appears to be lighter. And most people come to that conclusion because they perceive this 4th row down as receiving less light than this 2nd row down. Somehow the folding of this piece of paper is such that, well, these guys in the 4th row are getting less light. And because it's getting less light, for it to achieve the same light reaching our eye, that means it must be a lighter surface. It must reflect more light towards our eye to overcome the lessened illumination in the 4th row. Anyway, we now have a snake illusion here, and you can probably guess that these 2 diamonds that appear to be under a gray filter, or seen through a gray filter, are identical, physically speaking, to those 2 gray diamonds that are seen without that dark gray filter. And because we're seeing those 2 guys above through what appears to be this darkness, they end up appearing lighter. We're not seeing these 2 guys in the middle through anything that's dark, and so they appear a little bit darker. So, again, those diamonds are of identical physical gray value. So that's an illusion in some sense. And it depends on our visual systems trying to decompose what we see into variation according to surface propensities to reflect light, and variations in, well, the amount of light falling on the surface, how the surface is facing relative to the source of light, things like that. The central square here has the same physical gray value as that square indicated by the arrow. Pretty cool, huh? Well, it's pretty clear that this square in the middle is in shadow. And that shadow is created by this little cylinder here. So that cylinder casts a shadow, and that means that we are seeing this square as lying in a shadow. This guy, indicated by the arrow, is not lying in the shadow. So what can we say about the relative amounts of illumination? The square with the arrow is receiving a lot of illumination. The square in the middle is not receiving a lot of illumination. Physically speaking, these are the same amount of light reaching our eyes, and the only possible interpretation is that this is a lighter surface, the one in the shadow, and this is a darker surface indicated by the arrow. So that's a nice illusion. Not only do we work overtime to estimate the intensity of the light being reflected towards our eyes, we're also interested in colors. And generally speaking, if you have a, say, a red t-shirt, it's going to look like a red t-shirt if you remember those yellow lights we used to have. What were those called? Trying to remember. A tungsten. Yeah, so tungsten lights, sort of the old kind of light bulb, and they're sort of yellowish. So you could have your red t-shirt, and it would look like a red t-shirt under these yellow lights, or you could buy yourself a cool white light, fluorescent lights, or a daylight, or something that's really much bluer than these tungsten lights. It would still look like a red t-shirt. In fact, you could wear your red t-shirt at sunset or at dawn when the light again has a different color, and it would still look like a red t-shirt. This is color constancy. We're not only trying to figure out the lightness of a surface, we're trying to figure out how well it reflects light as we move across the range of visible wavelengths. A red t-shirt reflects red light better than it does green light or yellow light or blue light. That's what we're trying to estimate, how well it reflects light as a function of wavelength. So what we have here is a simulated change in the color of illumination. And you can see that the illumination, which is represented by this, the color of this, what appears to be a gray placard, the background, I guess is sort of more neutral for me, maybe even a little bit yellower. On the right, the gray placard is less neutral, appears to be a little bit bluer to me. Does it look like sort of a yellow on one side and a blue on the other? Our visual system takes this information into account, and it does this in a process that is, well, it's a process of unconscious inference. What our visual system says is, well, there must be a yellowish light source shining on the left and a bluish light source shining on the right. And it adjusts the perceived colors of the 6 surfaces accordingly. And what's interesting is that the light reaching your eye from this guy at the bottom left of the first picture is identical to the light reaching your eye from the bottom left of the second picture. That's also true for the 2 middle ones and the 2 ones on the right. Now, if you get to the correct viewing distance, hopefully we will see a difference. Let me check that this is working. Yeah, I see a difference. It's not very pronounced under these illumination conditions. Somehow this looks yellower to me and that looks bluer. When I look at those 2 guys, those are pretty closely matched, and this looks like a more intense blue. Oh, it's the top row, isn't it? Oh, that guy and that guy. Oh, much better. These guys actually look like those guys, but in fact, this is physically identical to that. This is physically identical to that. This is physically identical to that. So that's the illusion. when the visual system takes into account the yellow lighting here that it perceives and the blue lighting that it perceives here, these color patches, even though they're physically identical, end up looking different. And that's the effects of color constancy. This guy is physically identical to that guy. This guy is physically identical to that guy. And if I would read more carefully, I would have remembered that. So, color constancy in action. And I'm now moving away from the constancies to attention. So, we've talked about attention already somewhat. And in fact, I'm going to talk about Ann Treisman's visual search experiments a second time in just a moment. But before we get there, I think it's important to note that perception is selective, and it's something that takes resources. And our brains do not have infinite resources. In fact, it's important that we direct our attention to things that we want to learn more about, because we don't have enough resources to effectively devote full processing to everything in the world. We have to be selective. We have to choose what it is we will attend to and learn more about. So it turns out that selectivity is produced by what's known as orienting in almost all cases. And this orienting is a physical process whereby we orient ourselves towards an object of interest. So let me see. If I were to orient my attention towards the camera in the back of the room, well, I would do several things. One, I would turn my head so that my eyes are facing forwards in the direction of the camera, and that would ensure that the camera is foveated, and I know it's in the foveal area of the visual field that we have the greatest amount of visual processing available. Second, it turns out that there are several forms of auditory sensitivity that are greatest when both ears are facing a particular stimulus. In some sense, we've oriented ourselves to get the greatest amount of information concerning a distant object. And that's physical orienting. And it typically involves movements of the eyes, the head, the body. It turns out that we're also, here's an example of eye movements that we saw last time. There are also ways to direct our attention that do not involve physical orienting. So if somebody were to start talking right here, I could pay attention to them even though I continue to walk in this direction. It's very easy to pay attention to somebody in some direction other than the one towards which we are oriented. And that's an example of using effectively central attention processing to selectively attend to something. We'll talk about that in a moment. In any event, again, the key reason why we are interested in attention is that if we do not pay attention, if we do not selectively process information from the world, well, we're likely to learn nothing, because there's way too much stuff in the world and far too little processing capacity in our brains. In effect, there is what's known as a bottleneck in information processing, and numerous sensory inputs. Well, for vision, we can think about not only what it is we're looking at in the foveal region, but also everything out here that we're not looking at directly. Numerous sensory inputs. Well, what we actually end up processing in detail turns out to be the stuff that we're paying attention to. And so there's a lot of information that gets lost caused by this bottleneck in information processing. So attentional systems select information to process at these bottlenecks in processing. And it's very important that they work properly. People have studied brain areas implicated in attentional processing, and I want to note very briefly that there are areas in the parietal lobe, in particular parietal association cortical areas indicated in this light green color that are involved in attention. And again, attention, a large part of it is trying to devote attention to one particular location in space. And so you shouldn't be surprised that parietal cortex areas are involved there, because we know that parietal cortex, at least as far as vision goes, has something to do with, what were those pathways called from last time? The where pathways. Remember the what pathways and the where pathways? Well, the what pathways are involved in object recognition, and they involve a lot of processing in the temporal lobes. But the where pathways, they want to know where stuff is, how to reach for it, how we can best get there, where things are, so we can pay attention to them by orienting ourselves. The where pathway involves parietal lobe areas. So we shouldn't be surprised that attentional processing involves parietal lobe neurons, as well as frontal lobe neurons. And if you're interested in moving your eyes to look directly at something of interest, then you'll be interested in frontal eye fields and some of these other secondary motor areas. So here's another one of these. Basically, again, parietal cortex is very interested in locations and objects. There are the frontal eye fields not in this diagram, and there are all sorts of other structures that help you then move your eyes, your body, in accordance with your need to direct your attention through orienting. And one thing that this particular thing points out is the anterior cingulate region of cortex. So if you were to pull apart the two hemispheres of the brain up in the front, you would see that there's actually cortex down this midline part here, and that's where you find cingulate cortex. And people have discovered that anterior cingulate cortex towards the front is involved in monitoring conflict. So if you have two things you have to pay attention to, and there's sort of a conflict about which one you're going to do, well, you can be certain that the anterior cingulate is going to help you resolve that conflict. And it's involved in both cognitive and emotional processing concerning this sort of thing. Okay. Selective looking is what we can do with visual attention. And it's an important skill, obviously. We can find somebody we are looking for in a crowd. We can find our car in a crowded parking lot. We can sort of have a model in our mind of what it is we'd like to find, and then we can search through the available data looking for something that provides a close match to that model, be it a person or a car or what have you. And so this is directed attention, a very important skill in everyday life. And there have been lots and lots of studies of this sort of visual attention. And in an early study by a fellow named Ulrich Neisser, and this is now back in the 50s or so, you would do an experiment along the lines illustrated here. Your task as an observer, as a subject in the experiment, is to find the letter K. And most people, when presented a stimulus of this sort, what they do is they'd start at the top set of four letters, T, W, L, N, and they say, no, there's no K there. They then go to the next four letters, X, J, B, U, nope, no K. U, D, X, I, nope, no K there. And they keep on working their way down until they finally find a row that has a K in it. Ah, this row has a K. And they'd say, okay, I found a K. And they'd say, it's this row. And you can sort of imagine how long it would take a person to find a K. If the K were in the first row, it would be found very rapidly. If it were in the bottom row, it would take a long time. But if it were in the middle somewhere, well, it would take some intermediate amount of time. So if you were to plot how long it takes on average to find the letter K, well, it's going to increase as the K moves down the list towards the bottom, because most people will start searching at the top and move their way down towards the bottom. So the position of the critical item, and that in this case would be which row has the letter K in it. That's the horizontal axis, and that varies in this case from 0 to 50. And this is the time in seconds that it takes a person to find something. And you can see that as the item moves lower and lower and lower down the list, the time to find it goes up, up, and up. And so that's sort of a classic result. And it suggests that people search in a serial fashion. And this is not Captain Crunch cereal. This is serial as in a series, one thing after another. You check the top row, then you check the second row, then you check the third row, fourth row, fifth row. That's a series. That's a serial search, one by one. So there are different kinds of searches. And reaction times of this sort, how long it takes to do something, provide evidence for different kinds of searches. This is a serial search. Anne Treisman did experiments that we described already, where you get a different style of result. So again, let's suppose that our red O is the target. The red O pops out among these distracting items. In fact, these green O's don't distract very well at all. We find the red O fairly automatically. In fact, if we were to measure the reaction time to find the red O as a function of the number of green O's, we would find that finding the red O is effectively independent of the number of green O's. And let's see, the red O draws one's visual attention. It pops out of the display with all those green O's, and the time that it takes to pop out of the display with green O's does not depend on how many green O's we have. And here's another example of pop out. The time it takes to find our red O does not depend on how many V's we have, and that's because it has a distinct shape. It's really only in cases like this that you will now find that finding the red O depends on how many distracting items there are. If there's a small number of distracting items, we will find the red O relatively quickly. If there's a larger number of distracting items, it will take longer. So, when a single feature is enough for a target to pop out, times to find the target do not depend on the number of items. Search is said to be parallel. In this particular example, though, search is more difficult and search times are longer. In particular, search gets more difficult the more items there are that need to be searched through. And that's like that first result of Ulrich-Neisser, where we had to look for the K in that list. Well, the more rows there are, the longer it takes. And it's sort of the same thing with this sort of search here. And in such cases, people tend to search through the items one by one, looking for the red O. It's more of a serial search. The target in this case is a conjunction of features shared with the distractors, and the conjunction in this particular example is a conjunction of the redness shared with the V and the O shape shared with the green O's. So this target does not have a single distinguishing feature, rather it is a conjunction of features shared by distracting items. Search in this case is not something that occurs with a snap of the fingers, rather it depends on how many distracting items there are. So it's one of these serial searches. Searches in the other case do occur much more quickly. Now let's see, another classic result with visual attention is due to a fellow named Posner, and it shows the importance of directing attention at something that you want to learn more about. In fact, the experiment shows that if you're able to direct attention in the right location, then you will be able to detect a target more rapidly, and you'll be able to identify what it is more rapidly than if you don't direct attention. Now, intuitively, that should make sense. If I'm paying attention to, say, somebody over here on this side, then I will be able to see things in this direction and recognize things in this direction far more quickly than if somebody starts moving around over here. Well, I'm not looking over here. You know, I might not even see that something's happening, and I'll have a hard time recognizing what's happening. So what is important about Posner's study is it does not involve physical orienting. Normally, we direct visual attention by, well, moving our eyes on our head. So I can look here, I can look there. This experiment involves what's known as covert visual attention, where you look in one direction but pay attention in another direction. See? So I was actually paying attention to you, but I was looking at her. And that is something that's called covert visual attention. And what Posner showed is that if you have a covert visual attention looking in some direction other than the one that you're already looking at, well, you can speed up detection and recognition of visual targets. So let me now go through here. This is an example of top-down priming. And in this experiment that we'll go through shortly, if we cue a particular location where a visual stimulus is going to appear, then you're going to detect that stimulus more rapidly than if you are not cued, even if there isn't enough time to move the eyes towards the cued location. And what that means is that the spotlight of visual attention, or the mind's eye, is able to move as a result of the cue, and it's able to move faster than we're able to move our eyes. And even though we haven't moved our eyes, we're still getting the benefit of moving the mind's eye, of moving this spotlight of attention covertly. And the basic idea, again, is you can direct your visual attention to something you're not looking at directly. Now, this shouldn't be a surprise. As I stated before, all of the time we are directing our auditory attention to things we're not looking at. I can pay attention to sounds that are over here. I'm not looking at them. We can pay attention to sounds any direction we wish, really. But we can also do that with our visual sense. We can pay attention to visual things that we're not looking at directly. That's the novelty here. So here's an example of an experiment. And there are three kinds of trials in this experiment. In all trials, the person is fixating on the little plus sign, the little cross in the center of the screen. And by fixating, that means they're staring at it and they're not allowed to move their eyes. So in one kind of trial, at the beginning, they're going to get a cue that is an arrow pointing in one direction. And shortly afterwards, after this arrow cue appears, well, the arrow cue goes away and a target shows up in the cued direction. And in this example, the arrow is pointing to the right, so the cue is the right, and yes, we have a target showing up on the right. This is a valid cue. The arrow is indeed pointing in the direction where the target appears. So that is a valid cue. It's providing information where the target appears. And this is to be contrasted with a second kind of trial, where again, we're fixating on this cross, then this arrow cue appears. This time, the arrow cue is pointing to the left, but aha, it's a trick. Unfortunately, the target comes up on the right. That is an invalid cue. The arrow is pointing in the wrong direction. So you might be misled into saying, well, I'm going to get a target here on the left, and you might shift your attention to the left, but too bad, the target appears on the right. That's an invalid cue. Finally, there are going to be some trials in the experiment where you're not really going to get a cue concerning which side the target appears on. This is a neutral trial, and what you'll get is a double-headed arrow. And it's effectively saying, well, it might show up on the left, it might show up on the right. It's up to you to figure it out. So we're not really being cued as to which side something is going to appear on. Three kinds of trials. So on 80% of the trials in the experiment, the cue is valid. So that means in the vast majority of trials, we're going to have this situation where the arrow is pointing in the direction that the target will show up. So it makes sense to pay attention to the arrow, because 80% of the time it is a valid cue. Now, 20% of the trials, the cue is not valid. And that's going to provide a problem, but that's the way it goes. What are we going to measure in this experiment? Well, we're going to measure how long it takes for a person to judge the stimulus, the target stimulus that is being presented. And you can sort of figure out, well, if we're paying attention in the right location, we're going to judge the stimulus faster. If we're paying attention in the wrong location, we're going to judge the stimulus slower. And there we are. Response times are faster when the cues are valid than when they're invalid. So if the arrow points in the correct direction, that's a valid cue, and that's what we have on 80% of trials, then the reaction times, which are in milliseconds, might be around 220 milliseconds. That's pretty fast. So somebody will give the correct response concerning what the target is in about 220 milliseconds if they have a valid cue. Now, if they are tricked, and they are on 20% of the trials, if they are tricked with an invalid cue, it takes them substantially longer, significantly longer to report what's going on at the target location. And the idea is that, well, they're not paying attention to the correct location. It turns out that eye movements are monitored in this experiment, and the trials on which the subjects move their eyes towards the target are simply thrown out. They're not considered further. In this experiment, we're only considering data where the person succeeds in fixating that central plus sign. So any attention that we are allocating towards the target location, as suggested by the short reaction times here, must be covert visual attention. It's sort of like shifting visual attention centrally without actually moving our eyes or our heads. And that's what that means. And it turns out, well, such shifts can be as large as 24 degrees of visual angle. And you recall that, well, if this is the 0 degree direction, then this might be 90 degrees off to one side. So 24 degrees is about 1/3 of the way, 1/5 of the way, whatever, 1/3, 1/4. Let's say it's that much. So you can shift all the way from central out to this side here or that side there and still pay attention to things that are going on here, even though you're looking straight ahead. That's what that means. And that's pretty impressive. So these are covert, secret, central shifts of visual attention, not accompanied by eye or head movements. So that's the Posner experiment. Here's our bottom line. Almost always we orient our bodies, heads, and eyes so that we are looking at what we're interested in attending, yet we can direct visual attention centrally via processes of covert attention, just like we do for hearing all the time. Speaking of hearing, what about auditory attention? Well, we can listen to things in a selective fashion, and certainly if we are in a room where there are many people talking, we have to be fairly selective if we're going to get anything out of our experience. We more or less tend to pay attention to just one person and listen to them talk, and somehow zone out on all the other speakers in the room. This is known as the cocktail party effect, and typically we'll be able to hear people in our conversational cluster, and we'll follow what it is they're saying, but the other speakers, we don't really hear what they're saying at all. And that is clearly a sign that we're able to focus our attention on a particular person's voice in situations where lots of people are talking simultaneously. So this is selective auditory attention. And people have done experiments along these lines, and some of the best known experiments involve what are called dichotic presentations. And these are the sorts of things that you can do with headphones or earphones. Basically, these involve auditory presentations to your two ears. And if you're wearing headphones, what you can do is you can have one person talk to your left ear and a second different person talk to your right ear. So it's a dichotic presentation in the sense that each ear has a different speaker. And your job as a subject in this experiment would be to pay attention to the speaker in one of the ears. How well can you do this? Well, that would be a measure of your selective auditory attention. So how do we know that a subject in such an experiment is in fact paying attention to what's being said in one of the ears? Well, the standard task is to have a person shadow the message arriving in the attended ear. And what that simply means is to repeat back what the person's hearing, what the subject is hearing in the attended ear. So here is this guy wearing headphones. One ear, you're supposed to pay attention to what's being said. President Lincoln, blah, blah, blah. The other ear, well, you're getting stuff that you're supposed to ignore. The horses galloped, blah, blah, blah. So if you are supposed to shadow one ear's message, well, then this guy ends up sort of mumbling, President Lincoln, blah, 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 because he's shadowing what's coming into his left ear. And that sort of forces him to pay attention to what's coming in that ear. So, it's sort of interesting. The unattended ear, the one that you're not shadowing, the person who's speaking can change the language that they're speaking, and you won't notice it. So a subject in this experiment, they're paying attention to what's being said in one ear, and they're shadowing it back. And you have to wonder how much of the message in the unattended, ignored ear gets through. Well, if the speaker in the ignored ear changes language, you won't notice it. If you take that speaker and you start playing their speech backwards, you won't notice it. What you will notice, if somebody says your name in the ear that you're not paying attention to, you will notice it. You will notice if you switch voices to somebody you know well. You will notice if you change from a male to a female or vice versa. So effectively, changing the identity of the speaker is something that you will notice even if you're not paying attention. If somebody says your name, you will notice that even if you're not paying attention. But there are all sorts of other things that you will not notice. You will have no idea what the person in the ignored ear is saying. You won't notice if they change the language or play the speech backwards. You're just not hearing it. It's not somehow entering your higher centers of auditory processing. But there are some things that get through. Change of identity in your speaker, in the ignored ear, your name. So there's all sorts of results like that. People started doing this back in the 50s. So it's now at this point a very large literature on dichotic listening. So, what we just discussed were certain things that we can do to the message in the ignored ear. And this raises the more general question of what is perception like for things that we're not paying attention to? Well, it's sort of hard to answer that question, isn't it? Because how are we going to know about the perception of things that we're not paying attention to? It's sort of a conundrum right there. But it's a really good question. If we're not paying attention to various classes of stimuli, well, what is the quality of our perception for those stimuli? And there's all sorts of evidence suggesting that we are blind to many sorts of things that we're not paying attention to. And these are examples of change blindness. So let me get some examples for you. And let's see. Is it this one? Okay. So what we're going to get are mud splash stimuli. And I'm going to start with the airplane. And as it says, every few seconds we're going to get a mud splash. And we're supposed to figure out what is changing in the picture. And if you know what's changing, please do us a favor, do not say it out loud. You can go like this, oh, I see what's changing. But there will be people who won't see it, and so keep silent for a moment while we view this stimulus, and there it is. So there's our picture, and then you see these splotches. Do you see those splotches? Okay, those are the mud splashes. And it turns out that this picture changes every time you get those mud splashes. And the question is, well, what's changing in the picture? And it's one of those things, if you know what's changing, it's like, duh. But if you don't know what's changing, sometimes it can be tough. You see these mud splashes, bink. Something has changed. You see the mud splashes, bink. Something has changed. How many people know what's changing? Well, that's pretty good. That's actually very good. Well, if you look at the shadow, large, small, that's what's changing. And it takes people typically some time to see that this huge change is occurring because we're not really paying attention to it. Most people, when they get the mud splashes, they, oh, mud splashes, and that's what they're paying attention to. And if you're paying attention to mud splashes, you do not see that the shadow change its size. So that's an example of change blindness. And let me see if I can pull up another one. Traffic. Okay, so here we have these cars, and there we've got these like little mud splash deals coming up, and there is something changing. So there are the cars with mud splashes. There they are with their mud splashes. There they are with their mud splashes. How many people know what's changing? Oh, pretty good. Well, that's a solid white line, and that is a broken white line. And I think there are going to be some people who didn't see that immediately, and it's really amazing the sorts of changes that can occur without our being aware of them. So that's another example of change blindness. If you don't pay attention to things, well, you might see less than you actually think. Now let me go back here. I have a demo 23. I wonder if this is the right one. This is the right one. Okay. So I need to make, what we have here is a video which doesn't have any sounds, and, or does it have sound? I forget. Yes.
Watch this brief silent movie and then I'll ask you some questions about it. You saw a person get up from a desk to answer a phone, right? Did you notice anything change during the video? The video had two different actors wearing different clothing. Watch it again. Most people don't notice the change, a phenomenon known as change blindness. This video is from research by Daniel Levin and Daniel Simons and is copyrighted.
And we thank you for the video. Okay, so there's a very well-known example of this that I'm now going to try to display to you. Let's see, copy, is it here? Yes, now your job with this video is to determine how many times the white team passes the ball. So there's going to be two teams here. If you already know the answer, please don't say. Okay, so we're going to have a video, and our job is going to be to determine how many times the white t-shirt players have the ball.
This is a test of selective attention. Count how many times the players wearing white pass the basketball. How many passes did you count?
I saw about 12. How many people saw 12?
It's 15.
Oh my gosh, I missed a few.
But did you see the gorilla?
How many people saw the gorilla? Yeah, that's the trick here. If you're really paying attention to the white t-shirt players, sometimes you'll miss the fact that a gorilla walks through the scene. And that is sort of the most famous one of these change blindness demonstrations.
Research by Daniel Simons and Christopher Breed and is copyrighted. It is available for use in talks, training, and teaching on DVDs from
So back to the PowerPoint. If we are not paying attention to something that is changing, then it is likely that we will not perceive the change. A change has really got to be substantial for it to grab our attention in a bottom-up fashion. Most things, when they change, do not grab our attention in this way. It's not as though there's some big, shining red light that comes up suddenly and that draws our attention. No, most changes are more subtle, and if we're not paying attention to them, we will miss them. And we have to conclude that, yes, our perceptual representation of a complex scene may be somewhat less complete than we would like to think. And that's sort of a bummer, but I guess that's the way it goes, and it shows the importance of attending to things and trying to glean as much information as possible. That's what I wanted to say about perception, and it looks like we have 1 week to go. We're 90% of the way there. Please read Chapter 6 this weekend, and have a good one. Bye.